Now, it's no secret that in addition to role-playing games, I am a board gaming enthusiast. And in that narrative, certainly D&D has fueled it, but I love dungeon crawlers. I love the idea of going into a dungeon, fighting monsters, playing a character, spending power, getting treasure, and having an epic boss fight in the end. But if we look at the history of board gaming, this idea of being able to take the complexity of a role-playing game and the freedom, really the freedom, condense it down into a board gaming format where you don't necessarily need a DM, dungeon master, or depending on the system. I mean, we're talking D&D, but it could also be a GM. Some systems do this extremely well, but there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of complexity. You know, kind of the classic and ultimate and still number one board game that's really a role-playing game that tells a story is Magic Realm. But we have a lot of modern incarnations like Descent, Gloomhaven. There's a lot that's put out there. But ultimately, and these mechanics, I love Gloomy, these mechanics are self-containing. They're self-limiting. They're meant to be that experience. You're never going to be able to have the freedom, the decision-making of necessarily a DM, a dungeon master. Now, we are starting to see some ideas with board games that are app-driven. The Lord of the Rings game comes to mind, where more and more content is unknown and pushed out by an app, and the board game itself is sophisticated, but really it's just a placeholder. In time, things are, of course, tech is going to be brought in and made more complex. But the holy grail of a role-playing game experience where you don't need a DM or a GM, that's still out there. There are a couple of good options, and I posted up some of the tools and tech and talent that I utilize in running solo D&D games, and there's a reason for it. Maybe you're a DM and you just want to try out an adventure idea. Often when I write my own campaigns, I think they're great, but before I test them out on the table, I want to get some feedback. So I have a network of DMs that I can pass stuff to. I have some test players, but also occasionally what I'll do is I'll roll up a random party and literally walk that party through the adventure myself and just see what are the stress points, see how do the skill checks line up, what if there isn't an optimal build, can they still overcome it, is there a way, a choice to do it. But there's also times where situations change and just life being what it is and responsibilities with work, family, and school, maybe for a little while you can't play D&D or you're in between gaming groups as things realign. At that point, solo D&D, and this pushes us into the focus of this vlog, emulators and how they work. And by an emulator, we will see more and more app-based emulators, but right now kind of the gold standard is this emulator called Mythic. And a role-playing game emulator, it works for D&D. It actually works for any role-playing system. I've used it to play Alien the RPG just to learn the rules. I've used it to take a couple of Dark Heresy characters through things. But ultimately, it's a series of tables and charts that, and I am condensing it a little bit, that generate things down to yes or no based on probabilities. And some things are more yes, and some things are more no. So the idea is you start with a starting founding story. And you just kind of think that up. You plug that in. You're sold a mysterious map. You paid 10 gold pieces for that map. That's the story. Then you say, okay, well, what's the map? On the chart, it generates, is it to a dungeon? What's the probability of it being a treasure map? What's the probability of it maybe being a tomb or across the sea on a deserted island? And essentially through rolling dice and these modifiers, you get a yes or no answer. So now you know, okay, it's a map that leads to a tomb. So you go to the tomb. Well, what does the tomb look like? What is the tomb populated with? What's in this room? And it's not so much binary yes or no. You as a player ask questions. Okay, if it's a tomb and it's level 1, here's the probability of the 10 monsters that might occupy it. Zombies occupy it, yes or no? And you're doing this through rolling dice, and it does it a lot more eloquently than me explaining it. Yes or no? Zombies in there, skeletons, Bodax. Well, Bodax are actually much, much higher challenge rating, but you get the idea. and it slowly begins to populate the narrative. An excellent, excellent emulator. I find, and certainly works for solo D&D, absolutely. But I also find emulators interesting for those times where the traditional role-playing idea is here's a DM or a GM and here's the players. Getting together as players and utilizing it freeform almost to generate the story and to kind of play and push in that direction as opposed to just having a DM, just having the players. So I want to encourage you, if you're looking for solo for a little bit, or that's this point at where you are, and again, maybe you just want to learn the rules of D&D, look into the various emulators. Look at some of the ideas of playing D&D through an emulation type environment.